This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, I guess we can start. This is Michael Weatherburn, and he's not talking about the Hawthorne experiment.
I will mention it briefly once. Thank you so much for your introduction. And thank you for the. I'm on the New Researchers Committee of VAHS, and it's been so interesting coming to these events, hearing what a wide variety of subjects they address, and I hope I'll be able to provide an interesting talk too, which actually will touch upon the history of various different topics, such as voluntary action, also business and science. And I'll be addressing specifically the issue of voluntarism within paid employment, right? Because it's not just about pay and no pay. You can mobilize people who are being paid to be more productive, which is what I'll be talking about. So in 1940, a French man named Hyacinthe Dubreuil published a book entitled A Chance for Everybody, A Liberal Basis for the Organisation of Work. Over the prior decade, he had become a minor celebrity on both sides of the Atlantic for his 1929 volume Robots or Men, in which he described how he had been inspired by a biography of Frederick Taylor to leave behind his comfortable intellectual background for the American factory floor. His new book, in 1940, even contained an introduction by the author of Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. But what did this new book address? Well, it was addressing what was then a very fashionable thing to talk about in business and even novelist terms, which is the so-called human factor in manufacturing, and cited two 1938 canonical studies of human behaviour in factories. One was at the Hawthorne Works near Chicago in the US, the other was at the Roundtree Cocoa Works in York here in the UK. Now, to this day, the Hawthorne experiments remain legendary, believe me, in the fields of industrial sociology, industrial relations, and the history of business and the workplace more generally. Their core question remains relevant, which is why they're still so famous. Why do workers work, and what management tactics can be used to stimulate them to work harder, and indeed what management tactics will make them work less hard, which I'll also be talking about today. Now, hundreds of articles have been written on the so-called Hawthorne effect, which isn't even an actor's category, I will point out, discovered by Dr. Elton Mayo and many others at the Western Electric plant in Cicero, near Chicago, between 1924 and 1932, a phenomenon which appeared to demonstrate that experimental subjects act differently when they know they're being experimented upon. And this image on the slide there is from a sort of human resources training course or something like that. So stuff gets taught to people, thousands of people a day around the world, trust me. Numerous books about the studies have been written as well, and continue to be written. There are two in progress that I know of. And there's even a documentary on YouTube about Hawthorne entitled The Year They Discovered People. Historians have conducted extremely thorough examinations of the experiments, and unusually thorough. It's admirable that people have gone to the lengths they have. And indeed, an entire BBC Radio 4 documentary was produced a few months ago when one researcher in the United States had found a book of previously unexamined statistics. So it attracts this amount of attention. Now, of course, the validity of the tests has been vigorously contested, especially by Richard Gillespie's excellent book there, Manufacturing Knowledge. But that the experiments were unique remains unquestioned, and that's what I'm talking about today. Even taking into account the fact that Cocoa Works was smaller, maybe about a third the size, and the fact that it's shorter scale, the tests were of a shorter scale, and I think a copy. It is not that the literature works on the Cocoa Works is correspondingly smaller, it's simply that it doesn't exist. And so the presentation I'm giving today, which is the first on my research on this actually, aims to correct this historiographical misbalance. Now, I've traced Hawthorne's hegemony over this discourse, and indeed even the term Hawthorne effect, back to Harry Landsberger's publication in the 1950s, so 20 years after the events, in which he drew together ongoing debates about the Hawthorne studies, and concluded that their findings had been, to an extent at least, valid. And again, people have disputed Landsberger's contentions ever since. He's still alive. But what Landsberger did not address is that it is important for me here to observe that he only addressed the debates about Hawthorne specifically, and subsequent authors engaging with his arguments also did that. And so I'm circumventing his arguments and going back to the historical events on this side of the Atlantic in the Roundtree Cocoa Works in York. Specifically on the history of the British chocolate industry, Rowntree's plant was, and until relatively recently, in the 1990s, overshadowed, I think, by the Cadbury plant at Bournville. This is because it was the inspiration for Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and because it is a key case study in Alfred Chandler's massively influential business history, Scale and Scope. More recently, Robert Fitzgerald, I think to correct this, Robert Fitzgerald's thorough study of the cocoa works, there's the cover, added much to our knowledge about how the cocoa works changed and indeed sometimes stayed the same in the 19th and 20th centuries. And in my research more broadly, I build on this book by getting down to the factory floor, both in the experimental terms I should be addressing today, and more broadly in my work on liberal manufacturers to the changing dynamics of daily working life from about 1920 to about 1950. Specifically on the cocoa works and my subject of my discussion today, Seaborn Rowntree. He remains extremely well known to historians, and I think has been since his life and death, particularly those of the post-war welfare state and the public sector in relation to family allowances, workplace pensions and poverty. To recap some important facts about him, I'm sure many of you know all about him, but in case not, he was born into a prominent liberal Quaker family in York. Unable to attend Oxford or Cambridge due to his nonconformism, Rowntree studied chemistry at Manchester, and although he did not study his degree, he retained his love of experiments and dynamic statistics for the rest of his life. And I don't think Asa Briggs, when he covered Rowntree in his book Social Thought and Social Action, got to this aspect of Rowntree's philosophy and indeed practices in daily working life in his factory. Now, alarmed by the slum poverty, he discovered that persisted despite national wealth increasing. Rowntree was inspired by Charles Booth's poverty study of the East End to conduct a similar study of York. It was published as Rowntree's book Poverty in 1901 and remains a canonised text in the histories of British sociology, poverty and charity to this day, and I'm well aware of the fact that people contest the findings of it. What is less well known is his subsequent career as a factory owner and manager, I think for interesting reasons as I'll get on to. And now in 1915, as part of the establishment of the massive Ministry of Munitions, the Liberal Prime Minister David Lloyd George, his friend, who knew of Rowntree's enlightened management practices, invited Seaborn to become chairman of the Health and Munition Workers Committee, which of course tessellated well with his Quaker pacifism. While Seaborn could do nothing about the fact that many munitions were needed to fight the war, which he obviously didn't want to be taking place, he could at least ensure that munitions workers were not overworked or injured in accidents in trying to produce them too rapidly. And it was under, this is well known to World War I historians, it was under Rowntree's chairmanship of this committee that the research concluded that working hours in production do not necessarily correlate. In fact, increasing working hours too much can decrease the quality of work and the level of output and increase accidents. It may seem obvious now, but this is seen to be when this discovery originated from. Unsurprisingly, given the topicality of the subject at the time, it was here that Seaborn also picked up on the American debate about Frederick Taylor and scientific management, which is not something the historians have picked up on, which is exactly where I'm going with this. A movement which stressed the importance of payment by results, specifically sophisticated systems of piecework to encourage harder work. As his father wrote in January 1916, so just after the foundation of the ministry, BSR, Benjamin Seaborn Rowntree, is giving thought to scientific management, and I expect good results will follow the inquiry. But the forms of scientific management so far reported upon, while probably greatly helping the individual worker, do not promise help towards the creation of a corporate spirit. So scientific management was lacking in a certain perspective, not, I don't think, in the kind of turbo engineering perspective we have a tendency to project backwards onto it today. And indeed, I've been through Seaborn's travels and publications and so on, which are all held in the Borthwick Institute in New York, to work out what he believed he should do to the factory floor when peace resumes. And he travelled all over the US. Asa Briggs covered this, although not specifically what he was looking at with these work organisation methods. He wrote that Rowntree didn't like Fords and described it like being like hell on earth and things like this, but we don't get what positive examples he drew on from the United States. So he looked at various factories in the United States, Hood Rubber, Swifts, Kodak and various others, and found many organisation of work methods that could be used to encourage simultaneously harder work of individual workers, and also a method to kind of pool the work to produce this corporate spirit. And of course, it is well known that when Rowntree became the acting head of the firm in 1921, then the daily head, as it were, in 1923, he has strengthened lots of aspects of management and the social life of factory work, the cocoa work, such as sports clubs, pensions, things like that, and we know all about this. And we also know he was a key player in the establishment of the Institute of Welfare Workers, now the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, largest human resources organisation in the country. And also he was important in galvanising and strengthening the Industrial Welfare Society, the National Institute of Industrial Psychology, and a variety of management conferences and discussion groups. However, I mentioned worker welfare. He was not just interested in making it available for the sake of it. He was interested in how it could be obtained, and indeed why it should be obtained, and who should be supplying it. Now, historians have often looked at this kind of thing related to non-conformist manufacturers to work out whether there was a sort of paradox. Was welfare really about welfare, or was it about being productionist? I'm with GDH Cole and Rowntree on this one, as it was just a happy coincidence that it was better for everyone. But I look forward to hearing if anyone has any thoughts on that. Now, to get onto a philosophical perspective, and anyone who knows about the history of the Quaker religion, I look forward to your contributions on this, because I am not familiar with the dynamics of how this would play out with what I'm describing today. I think Rowntree had a kind of dualist vision of the universe, right? There was the faith side, which as far as I can tell was completely uncategorizable and unquantifiable, but I look forward to hearing your views on that. However, the material world was fully definable and largely quantifiable as well, and this completely comes from his training as a chemist. The world was knowable, and much of it, and this is very important to what I'm talking about today, could be reduced to statistics, which could be analysed. Nor was this philosophy rigid. The method of categorising and quantifying whatever his subject was could always be updated and improved. That which may not have been quantifiable in the past should be, probably, in the future. Sometimes these values could indeed be used to calculate value, which is the most key issue of what I'm getting at today. And indeed we know this already from his poverty studies of York, right? Filled with statistics. This is well known as an empirical sociology study, and it's all kinds of statistics on wages, nutrition, calories, and so on. And then when we revisit his later studies of York in the 1930s and 40s, and well into the 50s, I think, he made use of updated scientific methods on these issues. So I think there's really something in that, statistics management type thing. And indeed, an important point I wish to raise here is, despite Rowntree's retrospective reputation as a social scientist, and sometimes he's called an industrialist, this is indicative of the historiographical focus on his earlier life. By the 1920s, I'm using his actors' categories here, the term would either be businessman and sometimes capitalist, and this has taken on, I think, a rather poisonous terminology in subsequent years for interesting reasons. But he would always refer to himself as being on the side of capital and wanting to cooperate with labour. And just going to have to believe me on this one, throughout all my research, one of the Institute Scientific Management people, I expected to find this a particular three-word phrase in the Frederick Taylor archive, which I did not find. The only place I found it was in the Rowntree Staff Journal, circulated to the staff members rather than the workers. That three-word phrase being time is money. Right? But I'm not suggesting this is kind of turbo-aggressive capitalism. Rowntree always said he believed in harmonious relations between capital and labour, encouraged union membership, and I believe union membership of his cocoa works for those eligible was 100%, rock-solid union membership. As far as I know, there were no strikes. Maybe in the general strike there were some transport workers or something. Now, what of course makes him particularly interesting is that he was also the chairman of, he wasn't just a capitalist theorist, he was the chairman of a large company where he could put all of these theories about cooperative capitalism, workplace democracy in his own factory. And in addition to things like works councils, Whitley committees, these are very well-known covered topics, it played out in his analysis of work, which was the subject of what I'm talking today, the analysis and incentivization of work. Now, delivering a speech in Manchester in 1918, Rowntree describes, and I think the language here is absolutely fascinating. It sounds superficially, the very sort of accountancy language, but the language really is real scientism going on here. So, the splitting up of costs and their comparison of those with other factories are a wonderful means of enabling an employer to place his finger on the weak spots. Only when every process in the factory has been submitted to a minute examination is an employer really in a position to say whether his industry can or cannot afford to pay higher wages. Now, as this quote indicates, Rowntree was particularly keen on analysing costs and working out how they would correlate to payment. He had an entire staff to do this, set up under this gentleman here, Dr. Clarence Northcott. He was an Australian Methodist and PhD in sociology who had spent his entire career at the Cocoa Works as a labour manager. And again, there's lots of this categorisation, statisticalisation, and I've even got Northcott's PhD in it. It's very similar to Rowntree's approach to these kinds of things. And as I explore in detail in my research elsewhere, Rowntree was one of the first employers in Britain to bring in a system of work measurement, from 1923 onwards, whereby work was timed, analysed and converted into comparable data, whereby all the different factory jobs could be statistically compared and contrasted to assess the efficiency of workers and departments. I get to talk about this in York a while ago. Now, even the method of payment here, this is where voluntaryism comes into paid work. When debating industrial issues with colleagues who boasted about how much money their workers earned, Rowntree would respond, and I've seen this quote many times, with the admittedly rhetorical question, they may be paid that much, but do they earn it? Indeed, 90% of the workers in the 8,000 strong factory of the Cocoa Works were paid by results, which in theory, at least, increased output. And this data produced was very useful for factory budgeting. There's an entire book produced by one of his gurus, as it were, on factory budgeting. And this is a crucial point. This is why it's so interesting to Rowntree, is because this data could be used to connect minimum worker outputs to the minimum wages he stipulated were required for a minimum life, right? So earnings linked to expenditure. And indeed, it's so interesting to me, especially coming from a history of science background, the mathematical formula used to calculate these wages also included a clause, believe it or not, to ensure there was also a maximum rate of pay. Right? So the harder the worker worked, the smaller the bonus increased by. So as to make sure, and he got this completely from the Ministry of Munitions, to make sure that workers didn't rush their work or work too hard. And also he was genuinely concerned that workers would be paid too much. So, in addressing the Voluntary Action History Society, what is voluntary about all of this? How micromanagerial and bureaucratic this may sound. Well, Rowntree considered payment by results to be voluntaristic in this book. It's for the tape, it's entitled The Human Factor in Business. You can get it free off archive.org, the copyright's expired. This was voluntary compared to fixed pay, which is what most of us earn these days, I think. In this book, Human Factor in Business, easily one of the most reprinted books published about how to organise work in the interwar period, Rowntree argued that fixed day pay, and he agreed with Leverhulme on this from Unilever, who also wrote books about this. He thought that fixed pay, where every worker is paid the same, is a kind of workplace socialism, which was not just inherently unfair, but also gave no incentive to work harder whatsoever, because workers would see it was unfair that lazier workers next to them were earning the same as them, and thus it would just bring everyone down to a low level. Moreover, Rowntree theorised beyond that point, if workers were not incentivised by pay, then it would require heavy managerial coercion to boost the output of the workers, and he'd seen this in looking at other factories. Really, sometimes these factories were not nice places to be, and just required foremen going around shouting at workers and so on, and he did not approve of this at all. So, payment by results, he argued, was fairer to reward hard work in the short term. Again, this data produced allowed the managers to work out in the longer term who should get a promotion, because they could check over a very long period of time who's a consistent worker. And importantly, as I'll get to with these tests I described in my abstract, They were mathematically interesting, and if anyone knows about the present-day managerial shift towards gamification and statistics and trying to motivate people by getting high scores on things, it's something very similar to this. To Rowntree, compared to the stick of fixed pay and its accompanying managerial tyranny, the carrot of payment by results was fairer, freer, more democratic, and in terms of the fact it used precise quantification, it was also more scientific. And anything that helped a business to remain competitive, Rowntree argued, would be good for the workforce and for the management, because otherwise there'd be no jobs for anybody. However, he argued that pure piecework, so that's a 1-to-1 ratio of production to payment, encouraged too much individualism and competition. And so at the Cocoa Works, he would use these kind of artificially created small work groups whereby the bonus would be pooled between the workers. This was a kind of way of stimulating competition between work groups, but not competition between immediate workers and their workmates around them. Now, to provide some context to the period in question, from a factory floor perspective, the Cocoa Works experiments I'm talking about today, which are all embedded within this philosophical managerial paradigm I'm outlining. These experiments were conducted in the context of a huge national shift from fixed pay to payment by results, right? And then underwent even a huger shift during and after World War II. Indeed, when the Spectator needed someone to debate this specific issue with the richest man in the world, Henry Ford, they chose Seaboard Rowntree, and of course Henry Ford, $5 a day, it's the same for everyone. Rowntree vigorously disagreed with this for reasons I've outlined, and as we know, the Ford plant was, they even had workers spies and so on that they had just to coerce the workforce into working harder, which is the opposite of what Rowntree wanted to do. Obviously, in the early 1930s, Britain was in a depression, and Rowntree was selling luxury goods, which is an obvious problem in itself. Moreover, Rowntree was under intense competition from its largest manufacturer, Cadbury Fry, from its largest competitor, Cadbury Fry, and their market-dominant product, dairy milk. It's true. The factory was topical and well-known to people around the country. It was famous for its industrial peace, or industrial democracy, as Rowntree called it. Rowntree encouraged his staff to publish articles and books about the factory's operations, and I listed them all once. And the amount of articles is something akin to a university department output of publications. It's extraordinary the amount of material they were publishing. It's not extraordinary. I think Rowntree and his scientific outlook encouraged this. The factory was even the subject in Christmas 1932 of a special BBC radio feature. And the Cocoa Works magazine, there on the left, recorded that 2 million people listened to this report, in which Madge Monroe, teenage girl on the right, was a chocolate packer at the plant, and she described her day's work and how they would all sing songs as their daily work went on, and so on. She's a champion, apparently people would laugh at as they would visit the factory. Now, Rowntree's Cocoa Works is so rich in experimentation in terms of products and personnel, organisation, management, and so on, that one contemporary described it as the biggest practical university in the world, and I think that the publication is linked to that. Black magic was invented at this exact time to compete with dairy milk in terms of, it's a different type of product, right? Sort of sharing, it's all there, right? There was even a plan to launch in this period between Lloyd George, Rowntree, and other major liberal manufacturers, also who encouraged private sector research, to encourage the government to promote new industries, because by definition, if business became increasingly efficient, which it had to, it would also produce unemployment. I look forward to hearing colleagues' comments on how that plays out with the role of liberals in the state, because often I'm quite suspicious of it in this sense. Moreover, the work experiments were conducted with a much larger set of experiments at Rowntree. That's a different report, I'm not talking about that one today. Motion study experiments were being conducted, this Gilbreth type thing we all know about, replete across the Cocoa Works at this time period. I'm talking about this in Oxford next month. As with time studies, more advanced than the Frederick Taylor ones, different terminology being applied here. All kinds of vocational aptitude tests, so this is kind of jigsaws and things to test who would be good at what jobs, because there's an awful lot of waste in putting people in the wrong jobs. And entire industrial psychology research, again, trying to fit the person to the job. So we don't want any square pegs in circular holes, a phrase that Roundtree would usually use. And I think highly reminiscent of Hawthorne, I think this is a copy, judging by the fact that the two groups knew about each other and the chronology here. During this period, 1,300 employee interviews were conducted from 1929 under Northcott, whom we met earlier, at the Roundtree Cocoa Works. 1,300, there's a lot. Not as many as at Hawthorne, because they didn't last as long. And indeed, one thing I considered that broadly throughout my research, this is 1/4 of one chapter I'm presenting today, I consider whether historians of industrial research and development have considered all of this interest in personnel efficiency and so on, and I suspect this cost has not appeared in the data that is being analysed. The study, jointly conducted by Roundtree's, the Industrial Health Research Board, it was anonymised, as you can see, and the Medical Research Council, in fact all of the reports are anonymised, there were 100, maybe 200 I think, took place over the course of 54 weeks, so it took an entire year's worth of research being put into this. It studied 10 semi-experienced 15 and 16-year-old girls who were subject to the experiments for an entire year. Right? It's a serious business. And to maintain a highest level of control over the variables as possible, the study took place in a separate room in the factory, and there was one supervisor, or overlooker, as they were called, present at all times. So a room about this big, with 10 people in doing work, with one person supervising them at all times. And the fact that, and this is again touching on to the Hawthorne effect, where we know famously about the variation of light and so on. There's the opposite experiments to what are going on. It was considered obvious that moving the light and the heat and all of this would change the workers' perception of what was going on, and the idea was to keep all this stuff static as possible. And the test experiments were into pay, and what kind of pay promotes this kind of voluntaristic spirit amongst the workers. So they did not need managerial coercion, right? Now, as we can see from here, don't have any pictures, there may be some in the Borthwick Institute, some buried somewhere, but I don't have them. Our 10 workers were anonymised, probably one of the reasons why we don't know anything about this, because the US, the comparison is the US publications were usually as explicit as possible as to where they'd been doing it. The British comparisons were as anonymised as possible to make them appear sort of scientifically valid, but it makes historical research very difficult or different in this respect. Now, each worker was already semi-experienced as categorization in such fascinating jobs, I'm sure, as unwrapping, wrapping, packing, weighing, and as you can see, weighing and wrapping. The workers were, it's absolutely fascinating, workers were rotated around these jobs, of course, to a very strict rota, to assess if any particular workers, or they were all girls, were particularly suited to any specific jobs, and if so, why, so that then they could use this material for aptitude assignment in the future. And the 10 girls were studied from 8 to 12 and 1 to 5, with the first 5 and last 10 minutes of every work period used to conduct interviews about feelings of fitness, boredom, fatigue, and the like. It's extraordinary amount of data when you think about it. Indeed, the quote, "I dread every morning except Sunday," in my title came from one of these interviews. So, not necessarily as happy, well, maybe we'll go on to that. And indeed, more monitoring than this was undertaken. The behaviour of the operatives was studied, and their remarks on their appearance and speech were considered. And it was also noted by investigators, output was recorded for every worker every quarter of an hour for 54 weeks. Right? And we've got some data here presented. The reports are filled with these graphs into these statistical variables, and I could go through them one by one. I don't think that would be fruitful. I'm obviously happy to discuss any of the ones I showed today, or indeed any of the others. As you can see, but what I'm trying to get at is this empirical statisticalization we know about from the poverty studies that went straight into this kind of factory floor experiments and daily working life. As you can see from these slides here, these experiments were replete with data tests, experiments, and comparative graphs. As I said, we could go through and micro-analyse all these statistics, as historians have done with the Hawthorne effect, to test if they were historically valid on their own terms, I don't think we should do that today, but by all means ask me about that. From the report's descriptions, the qualitative ones, years later, summoned from an anonymity, the humanity exuded from these reports. I'm just going to read out some quotes because they're absolutely wonderful. So they produced personality reports on all of these 10 girls. So, quote, from a temperamental standpoint, the most suitable workers A and E. They were quiet, unobtrusive, and seemed to be practically immune from distracting influences. Sometimes they worked for hours without speaking, and yet they appeared to be happy and content. Worker G, go back to so you can see where they're all standing. Worker G had much in common with A and E, but was more determined, energetic, and disturbing to the others. Although her rate of working was often high and consistent, she had periods of slackness when she appeared to be disgruntled and bored. C and F, I love these descriptions, C and F were slim, vivacious and quick in their movements. They were lively, cheerful and talkative, and their chatter was animated and amusing. D and I, we're getting onto the negative ones now, you couldn't make this up. D and I were the most troublesome and unproductive members of the group. They were big and muscular and masculine in appearance, while temperamentally were boisterous, assertive and expressive. Worker B was similar, but her superior capacity for work combines with an intense desire to excel, making her the most productive member. Worker J, there she is, was an introvert who spent most of her time daydreaming and behaved childishly. She was a child, but never mind. She had a fertile imagination and wanted to be a novelist, and sadly, because we cannot identify, she may have been a novelist, we don't know. Worker H, now this is why I want someone to research and find out who it was. Worker H, finally, was sullen, secretive and vengeful. She was heavy and dull, and had no sense of humour, and was teased unmercifully by the others. She was often talked quite openly about success with the boys, and the attention thus aroused seemed to provide compensation for her inferiority in other respects. Her highest output was obtained in the combined weighing and wrapping process, there you can see it there, and when engaged on this kind of work, she became more confident, assertive and cheerful. Her behaviour on this and other operations provided a striking example of the effect of success and failure on disposition and mood. This operative was temperamentally suitable for repetition work, provided she did not have to come in contact with comparisons with other workers of superior ability. End quote. As these comments suggest, the express purpose of the experiments to assess what conditions would stimulate the highest output. Right, this is not welfare in the. Well, it's directly linked into pay. Of course, there would be other specialists who are interested in heat and light and welfare, dentistry, all that kind of stuff. There's an entire specialism within the Ranchi Cocoa Works just assessing payment by results and how it works. It was automatically assumed in these experiments, it was the only thing that was being tested really here was output and what pay levels correlated to it and speed of work. It was assumed therefore that pay was the core, if not sole, issue at stake. No experiments of it have been done with any varying working hours or anything like this. 3 methods of payment were investigated, and this may sound unimportant, but I'll get on to why it's important in a bit. As you can see, bottom right there, time work, so it's fixed pay, piecework, top right there, that's 1-for-1 ratio, and a bonus. And as you can see on the bottom right, there's the level of output, time rates, the lowest produced, piece rate the highest, and bonus in the middle. They were interviewed about this, which is interesting and all this kind of thing. All 10 girls consistently moaned that time pay was incredibly boring. Right? It provided no incentive to work whatsoever. And Weatherburn et al. Were very happy about this because they agreed. It concluded also that piecework produced the highest output and that bonus rates produced in the middle. However, the work rate, as I have already mentioned, it was well known that this produced perhaps too much individualism, and so the conclusion of the experiments was to continue and expand this bonus rate measure there in the middle. And I should explain why that's important as I'm drawing to a close. I should explain why that's important because it's shaped the historiography of British industry, very important, depending on who's involved in this. Now, the concluding results, well, firstly that factory work is very boring, was one of them, as if we didn't know that. but they put it there, scientific evidence. They also decided that isolating workers leads to an increase in output by 20 to 50%, which I think is important here. So they concluded that they need to be, how can I put it, physically isolated, statistically pooled in these bonus payment methods as a way of creating this kind of statisticalized corporate spirit, numerical. And the report, this is very interesting, it's the final sentence of the report, right? The concluding report. A feature of the results obtained in this experiment was the marked response to the operatives to slight changes in the conditions of work. In particular, they became unduly discouraged by minor difficulties. This seemed to be due to the monotony of the conditions, so that comparatively slight variations produce important effects. And those important effects were negative ones. So in effect, whether we agree with the Hawthorne effects, the Roundtree ones actually produce the opposite results, which is if you intervene, workers get less productive because they are genuinely stimulated by these payment methods and so on. So was there a Hawthorne effect of Roundtrees? I'm saying yes, but it was inverse, and that's interesting in itself. And this stuff did play out in how Roundtree stimulated output from then on, well into the 1930s. Does the story end here? And I'm going to end this on 2 points here. No, well, the answer is no. When we visit other publications prior to the 1950s, it becomes clear there are far more studies taking place than the two I've mentioned today. Thomas Bata, who was well known at the time and now is not, he was a Czechoslovakian shoe magnate who had a subsidiary in Essex, also conducted studies like this, and I have not yet located what the experiments did. I've also seen contemporary references to German experiments too, and that's of course extremely interesting if they relate to the Third Reich period, because of course managerialism takes on a different perspective. To conclude, where am I going with this? Well, I've got 3 points to finish on this. This bonus rate, and this was extremely politically compromising to the British and American manufacturing communities after World War II, this bonus rate, Roundtree et al. And many other British manufacturers copied off some US manufacturers in the early 1920s. Okay, Michael, who cares? Surely it's just about numbers and statistical models. Maybe. Actually not. The guy who invented this specific bonus rate and the calculations that go into it was a guy called Charles Beddoe. It was a thing called the Beddoe efficiency system, a labour measurement. He was a very successful businessman in the 1930s. One source says he was one of the highest income earners during the Great Depression in the United States. The reason why this is important is because in 1944, the news broke to all the world's newspapers that he had committed suicide while being in prison in Miami, being held on a charge of treason, because the treason being for collaborating with the Nazis during World War II. This caused then, in the late 1940s, many liberals in Britain and in the US, in Britain, a specific book called The Making of Scientific Management. It was written in late 1940s, series of 3 books. This caused these liberals, who were very embarrassed by this, because they'd been using this for years, and there often was no problem with it, but it looked bad, to rewrite history without all of this in it. Right? That's why we don't know this. It's not that it's been neglected, it was actively written out, and I've discovered why. So that's where I'm going with it. Secondly, my study of Roundtrees, and incidentally, as I say, Roundtree gets a quarter of a chapter, Beddoe gets 2, so he's a major study of mine. I'm also looking at, now we know this was happening, I'm looking at, we also know that Beveridge and Keynes, both liberals, were extremely influential in the post-war Attlee government. We know Roundtree was influential in some respects, like pensions and workplace welfare and so on. I also think Roundtree was incredibly influential in these kind of work incentivization methods, but we don't have a history of that, and that's what I'm providing. And finally, something to note here is the 30th anniversary of the miners' strike right now, and I, like many people, some anyway, the people in the room, is too young to remember it. And it is a shame, because it means we don't have many people writing about the history of British manufacturing. I encourage people to also do the same, especially because when we think about it, that strike, I think, is still regarded as iconic in Britain's post-war deindustrialisation process, sometimes called industrial decline, and a signal in the important shift at the base of Britain's economy, one of the bases of it, from manufacturing to finances and services, the importance of which I think is still obvious of us today. Thank you for listening.
I'm just wondering how many people here have actually worked for those sorts of, under those sorts of conditions, not necessarily in a factory, but for peace rates, and that kind of experience is it still common, or is it simply departed?
It is agriculture. I've got a brew picking very much like that.
Yeah. Was it just 1-to-1 piece ratio?
Yeah, you picked, you got it weighed.
Yeah.
You had a foreman with a stick who'd tap you on the shoulder if you thought you were working slowly. Yeah.
Coercion, eh? So you can do both. No, I mean, I've had many boring jobs because I got interested in the history of this, but never for piecework. It's always been. I think it went out of fashion in the 1960s. There was a series of studies on glacier metals by W.B. Brown or something, and some other people.
And Elliot Jacks.
Yeah, I think Brown was a Labour peer.
Yeah.
No, Brown was the managing director of Glacier Metal.
I thought he was also.
It might have been a Labour peer, but he's interested in that.
Oh no, I know. And so the subsequent series of experiments, by the way, in those experiments, he references back to the fact that he knew that Roundtree had been doing this stuff, and that he was doing a new wave of experimentation into it. But he also references the Hawthorne works. And I think that's where I picked up on this in the first place.
I actually worked when I was, some years ago, I worked as a tape transcriber for the Royal Courts of Justice. And we were paid by the folio of 72 words. And so, you get the tape and then you just type like a bastard, basically. And it's because the thing about it was that I always found that he was thinking about money. And if you got somebody with an accent who is hard to transcribe, you're really, really resentful, or if you had to go to the books of documents and put in the long quotes and stuff. And I mean, it was really interesting, but it was a kind of, I found it really a kind of negative and disturbing. And you were really in competition. You wanted to finish before somebody else might get your turn. It was.
You're describing interwar British manufacturing, I think.
Is it? Yeah.
Oh, across the board, the switch is very noticeable. Loads of people like Eric Hobsbawm and Jonathan Zeitlin and so on have written about the shift from piecework to what's called premium bonus in about 1890 to 1920. It's the bit after that I'm writing about where they got more sophisticated but very politically dangerous to talk about due to this Beddoe fellow who has been very successfully written out of our history, who I've recovered from the grave. I'm writing a biography of him actually, so you'll go and buy it when I've finished it. Yeah.
Michael, you're saying, or you seem to conclude there in a way that there was the opposite Hawthorne effect.
Yep.
Here. Let's see if I can describe a hypothesis that says it was the other way. It wasn't that way around. Is it about the fact that there are other psychological factors at play in the experimental group that meant that their real reason for the success of the bonus system was more that they understood the sort of humanitarian nature of Roundtree's production methods and the fact that they were being researched on, and therefore that was a Hawthorne effect, and therefore because of that external effect it was having a perverse influence on the experiment itself.
I'm sure that's the introduction to the main report on this is very consciously aware of the fact that simply doing anything will, these bored 16-year-olds are going to notice it. And I just think that my answer is yes, I agree. I'm sure it did have an impact on this. I think what these experiments did, all they did was confirm what Roundtree et al., and especially Northcott, because he was the guy behind all of this, already were doing.
And then I had sort of two questions. Who was paid for the research? Was it entirely financed internally by Roundtree himself, or was there any external?
Great question. I was hoping someone would say that. The answer is I don't know. As far as I know, the IHRB, I assumed the archives would be in the National Archives, but they're not. So I don't know where they are. I need to follow that up. I haven't found. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if Roundtree was paying for it. He and APM Fleming from Metropolitan Vickers had a whole thing about this, about private sector research and why they should do it and why capital should take a risk on this stuff. But I don't know.
And the other question was, what was going on here, and the experiments going on with the workforce is sort of, in a sense, Taylorism, Mark II or something.
It's the next section. Yeah.
What was going on managerially with the management of Roundtree at the time, and was that also influenced by management theory, maybe the ideas of Fayol and others?
Great, thank you for that. I addressed that in my writing, and I'm writing it now, and a bit stuck. This Roundtree's internal management consultant, guy called Lyndall Erwick, OUP had just published a biography of him. He said that what they did was functional foremanship, which is what Frederick Taylor said. So a division of management into the division of foremanship into 8 different tasks, or 4 or 6 or whatever, depending on what Fred Taylor was saying, who he was trying to impress at the time. I was unable to find concrete evidence of that other than what Erwick said in his autobiography. The Fitzgerald book covers the kind of higher level strategic stuff. Just the foreman level, what I do know is there's very much the formalisation of the foreman and the overlookers at the time. They were taking internal qualifications, and they would. It was being more sort of very lower management was being much professionalised at the time. But in answer to, on Fayol, I haven't seen the influence there. I've only seen Roundtree et al. And all of his gurus, as someone once described them to me. I think only picked up on Fayol later on.
Yeah, he wasn't translated into English until about the 50s. Well, wasn't he?
There is stuff. He's in the 1930s. Actually, one of the reasons I'm pointing out is why certain managers became famous much after we think they were, including Fred Taylor, who's a product of the 1960s and 70s, principally. So as to camouflage what the practices that retrospectively got tainted. And then, and you use the word Taylorism, I don't. The technical term work measurement is what they were talking about. Again, the Taylorism thing is a way of talking about this while avoiding talking about what we're really talking about, because the sources are so hard to find. I mean, it took me to 8 countries to find out what was really going on here, just to recover this history. Yeah. Thank you for the excellent questions.
Can I ask you a question about gender, please?
Of course. Very important.
Because it's interesting that you've got a group of girls there,
yep.
and those interesting little descriptions you read out, they're heavily gendered. So where does gender play in this? Are they studying groups of men? Are they coming up with different schemes as to how you incentivise men to women? How does it play out?
They were testing men. They were doing all kinds of studies on men as well, yes. And the data I found on this is from loading boxes onto and off trains that were taking place around this time, because they had done it so well to the cocoa works. They were extrapolating all the methods out to the train depots for loading stuff. The experiments are basically the same. What kind of method, wage incentive program can be used to, because once you statisticalise how many boxes you're loading and what weight they are and all this, then you can apply it to the payment by results again. And the experiments seem to be pretty much the same and produce the same results on adult men.
Because it's interesting, really, because there are all those discussions too about the way in which skills are defined, and whether certain jobs are seen as skill, and that gender, the way that gender defines skills. So it's interesting that what you're saying from this is that actually gender isn't playing a distinguishing part.
In my research more broadly, there's a wonderful book called Women Assemble by Miriam Glucksmann. I don't think she's here, and there's a book called The Development of the Labour Process in Capitalist Societies by Craig Littler, I think has sadly passed away. And they point out in the Great Depression this kind of wage incentive programs typically applied to kind of new industries and typically to unskilled jobs which were being done by women. I take the story up to about 1950. In the later 30s and 1940s, this stuff all got applied to men as well. Not all men, but many. Even in engineering, Even in building, that was not until 1948 the Ministry of Works okayed it with the building unions. But yeah, so maybe I think it initially was young women, but then moved into, and it was quite, the practices were quite replete in post-war Britain.
You did mention the trade unions.
Yep.
I wonder if there's anything further that can be drawn from that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of sources. I don't know which trade unions they were, or in terms of the library resources. I'm thinking of the TUC libraries collections. I wondered, have you looked at any of those, or is there a source there? Is there more of the story?
Oh, yeah, there's loads. Yeah, I've been up in the Modern Records Centre to look into this. I mean, I have a chapter on Labour's response to all of this, not the Labour Party, because they didn't really have one. I cover the TUC, the Transport General Workers Union, which is the principal. Ernest Bevan is one of my main case studies, actually, because he negotiated the introduction of these things and the payment rates and all this kind of stuff across various places in 1932. I mean, yes, the TUC did a massive survey on this in 1932 or 3, and they kept all the data from it, from all the questionnaires that all the sub-unions wrote back to them, and so on. The other union I look at, much more militant, is the Amalgamated Engineering Union, who are extremely resistant to this, shall we say. Frankly, the management got cleverer and learned to avoid the unions, and during World War II, and this is an absolutely fascinating switch, in 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party threw its full weight, which is quite substantial at the time, behind productionism, and we find the AEU flips very quickly as well into being the biggest supporters of payment by results you can get from summer 1941 onwards. And so basically the last bit of resistance, if you want to call it that, kind of gone by then. Yes. But it was quite hard to get at this because the terminology is always really complicated at the time, because sometimes people are often trying to hide what they're doing because they're not always very popular. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Margaret Bonfield, does she feature at all?
Bonfield, she's interesting. Not yet, no. I think she will materialise. As I say, Bevan and Cripps are the two ones I principally look at. Because Cripps again was a chemist, right? Like Rowntree, was trained in chemistry, and he loved his statistics, like Rowntree did. And so he was big on that. When he was the Minister of Aircraft Production, really was big on using consultancies to implement these things to increase the production of aeroplanes. And these are people in Labour here. It's interesting.
Okay.
But what aspect of Bonfield do you think? Because I ought to look her up.
Well, it's colourful in that we've just hit the 60th anniversary of her. She was a cabinet minister. She is a woman. She's got that position at a relatively early time in history. Mm-hmm. I wonder if she was more alert to those issues.
I suspect so. Yeah, good, very good. Thank you. Yes, I'll follow it up.
Christine Coates, who's just retired from the TUC Libraries collection after 47 years.
Wow.
What a source. Is quite keen on Margaret Bonfield. I'm sure she'd direct you.
I'd been there. I hadn't thought about it for this reason. One of the things I found there was a fantastic set of cuttings, newspaper cuttings. Some poor person in the past had to go through every newspaper every day picking out these topics, and then it's still cardboard index cards.
They do invite people. Well, it's not getting onto a separate subject, but they do invite people to take up interest. I've personally taken interest in John Burns, and the TUC Libraries collection is a very large collection at University of London Met. It's got a website. It was very much supported by people like Tony Benn, late Tony Benn. Yes, there's a lot of work to be done there. There is a new person that's come in to take over from Christine Coates in the last 6 months. And it is in areas that you wouldn't automatically think of being a rich resource. It's not just trade unions, it's about transportation, it's about new towns, it's surprising areas of material that they hold there.
And they hold the, as I understand it, the original manuscript of the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, which I somehow forgot to look at when I was there, but yeah.
And there's obviously personalities that can feature, like the Inland Waterways equivalent of the Women's Land Army, for example. Some really
I
colourful
know about that.
personalities there. Housing and planning. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just thinking back about working, and I used to work for Edexcel, marking examination script.
I've done this as well, yeah.
Right? And
So boring.
it struck me, it was negative in two ways, I think. The first thing was, you started off very, very slowly because you hadn't learned the mark scheme. But your production would go up, or you increase the speed and become a better marker, I hope. Once you learnt the mark scheme, because you can cast to the side, just mark the script, you don't have to keep on going back to it. And the second negative thing was, supposing you've got a really good girls' grammar school, yeah, like from Jersey or somewhere like that. And every girl produced pages and pages of closely argued and analysed material, which took you forever to mark to a tree, let alone the whole school. So you tended to welcome very, very low productive and if a kid actually produced a script which had, more or less 2 words, and you got out of it, yeah, done that, you got the same money for a kid who produced rubbish.
Yeah, but it's quicker. Yeah, piecework. I think this is a question.
It's like kind of following on from that, because I'm interested, I guess, in relation to sort of gamification specifically, like how all these play into a much smaller timescales. So that what we've been talking about in terms of people's personal experiences is the relationship of the length that tasks take to a particular fixed reward. But I just wondered, I guess, what in this case were being taken, what were the bases which were unshakable? So, because they were measuring the girls' productivity at a very close grain, right, every 15 minutes. But they weren't going to pay them every 4 hours. I mean, maybe if they paid them at the end of every shift.
Once a week, I think, yeah.
Right, so I was wondering and what the kind of role of different organisations in deciding the durational aspect of pay versus task.
Yeah, interesting.
Do they ever question the kinds of pay schedules that
all the time. Yeah. This is a big deal. I'm just thinking, because I specifically looked at kind of payroll history. Yes, they did think about it very hard. The one of the things that you're supposed to do with this kind of stuff, and this was actually, it really was done. I found some interviews from Leicester on this. Some ladies interviewed in the 1970s. Is your static pay? Because one thing to point out here is this could be there'd be a minimum, not so much in the experiments, in the daily working life, there'd be a minimum guaranteed wage, right? This correlates to minimum minimum living standards, right? Yeah. And then you'd only be paid over that with the bonus, and you get your static pay in a sort of grey envelope, and then your bonus pay like a red one that was meant to produce, meant to make you. It's meant to be kind of voluntaristic. We might think it's being a bit acquisitive, but that's not how they looked at it. And in one of the interviews, it's so human looking at this stuff. This lady said that all she could remember from this was receiving her static pay, that's fine. And then one day going, I've got a bonus, and then opening it and having a half penny, which was less than the value of the envelope. Right, this absurd "I'm all right, Jack" stuff really happened, all over and if I find people who are around at the time, it's been fascinating interviewing people from the 1950s, who are sort of time and motion men and all this, to tell me these absurd stories that went on as trying to get tiny bits of efficiency increase. But anyway, to answer your question, what do you want to know?
I guess I was just interested in that generally, but yeah, specifically, like if did they imagine paying people every 4 hours, or did other organisations like the unions have periods which they considered to be the best.
Yes.
Who was negotiating and what were the kind of terms, I guess?
I'm not sure. I mean, wages are typically paid once a week and salaries once a month, I think, which is kind of like an old, just kind of middle class, working class division. It seems to be one of the things that divide people into castes, supposedly. I haven't seen anyone paying at that rate. What I have seen, though, and this is other experiments done on this is in Miriam Glucksmann's book, is output boards being put up of the relative outputs of different work groups, with the idea being it's kind of like a league table. And the people I've interviewed, I haven't found much evidence of this actually taking place, and the people I've interviewed said that this was normally, it seemed to be too aggressive for a British context. Americans did it all the time, apparently. So you didn't do this because they thought it was a bit too coercive. That would be the way you'd get your, you took a gamification, that you can see every second, right? That would be the equivalent to that. Yeah.
Michael, just a random thought.
Yeah.
You said that this sort of bonus rates payment system went out in the 60s and you don't see it much anymore. Is that true of all industries, or do you?
Not the finance industry.
Yeah, because I was just thinking the most obvious present day thing I can think of is call centers. They're really actively monitored on how many seconds you take to respond to your call, whether you're doing other things and so on and so forth. So I don't know, that might be something to look at to see if there's any direct link between the two.
This is instinctively one of the things I pick up, but also we've seen all the TV shows about Amazon and UPS and all of this, statistical management, and to some extent I understand what the businesses are doing, because there's so many items, you need some way of inventorying everything to direct the person to get the millions of things, these huge warehouses. On the other hand, as you say, it makes it sound like a sort of call centre type sweatshop thing.
So I suppose, I suppose the question is that, did it sort of go away and come back, or is there
I've been trying to work that out. This is now me taking it into speculation, which I'm sure David, our mutual supervisor, would not approve of, but I'm speculating because I found a book written by the International Labour Organization, it's a subdivision of the UN, and it was a book on work study, and it was part of their feature on productivity. And they suggested, this was during the phase when British, and especially Britain, but the United States and some of Western Europe was outsourcing its manufacturing overseas for various interesting reasons. And they suggested in this process you should follow their guidelines. The guidelines were ICI's work study methods, which I concretely 100% demonstrate was this exact Benno system bonus stuff, right? So the ILO were telling people they should be using it in these what was called the third world. I have not. It would be extremely laborious to go to these places to match up directly, the sort of mirror, to see if people actually followed the practices, because sometimes they didn't. But at least the suggestion was there that it should directly correlate as the industry moved from one place to the next. As I say, I don't know whether they actually did it or not. The trouble is, companies are very secretive. Foxconn are not going to let me look at their daily working life practices on this, but you could, in theory, easily do this.
I was just going to add on that. You brought up a very interesting point about the finance industry. There's a fair bit of research, and I'm trying to think of the Dutchman that's put it all together, and I can't remember his name. And the difference between using payment by results, where you've got immediate feedback on quality, which this was, you can check straight away, have they wrapped this to the quality standard, fine, it's okay. And where you start introducing payment by results where you can't do that, and where the gap between understanding what the quality of the work produced is particularly large, the finance industry, it was only several years later that we found that they were doing things like selling mortgages to people who couldn't afford to pay them back and making massive bonuses and all of that sort of stuff. And therefore, the actual negative impact of payment by results in any form where you haven't got that feedback. It's not a good research on that.
It's it's really interesting. Again, I would only have to speculate whether there's a causal link between these. Whether it'd be really interesting if we could conclude that what's supposed to be the most basic factory floor assembly methods have ended up in our finance industry.
Quite.
I could only say that's an interesting thing to raise. Yes.
I mean, it's almost gone. I mean, with a few exceptions like call centres and other things, it has rather gone out of manufacturing and been replaced by other much more sophisticated things. Whereas it's being taken into, it's even in the voluntary sector. I mean, the corollary to payment by results is performance-related pay.
Isn't it the same thing?
Yeah.
Oh right. Okay.
Yeah. But there you've got absolutely no quality standard. It's usually done by the manager, or if you're really lucky, a bit of 360 degree. It is completely and utterly not supported by research. In fact, as soon as you start getting that sort of break that link between the ability to judge, and it's not usually called quality, it's called lots of other things, then payment by results or performance related pay actually has an inverse impact on quality of work. Works.
Well, in a way, what you're saying, all these examples we're giving now of the kind of horrors of it are really divorced from Roundtree's. I mean, this whole business about fitting people to the work or the work to the people. I mean, that's if you're in some factory in Bangladesh and you're just sewing like crazy. I mean, it's not about you. Is it your best skill set or you're happiest doing this? It's just the coercive production. I mean. But did it actually work? Because it strikes me that a lot of this stuff is actually quite expensive to manage.
Absolutely.
You're training your foreman in 8 steps as opposed to just going around and shouting at you, which is really cheap. I mean, it's.
This is it's one of the things retrospectively is, was this actually efficient on its own terms? It was efficient on its own terms. Whether it was efficient is a different matter.
Yeah.
And this came up actually. In the 1960s, when so-called post-war industrial decline. I think post-war industrial outsourcing may have been caused for completely different reasons than lack of intervention. Actually, maybe it was too much. Mr. Dr. Northcott, whom we met earlier, would be questioned on this frequently, and he knew full well that all this efficiency methods cost 600% more than to administrate straight piecework. 600%, right?
People paid more rate at a higher rate too.
But the cost simply, I've heard these wage books, production books, are massive. I found them from a small factory in Essex, and these books, this big, with an iron spine in them to keep them together because they're so huge. And this was a problem in World War II. As all the workers were saying, we've been told there's no paper, and you're filling all these little forms, time and motion forms or whatever.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be called that because it was a negative term, but. But anyway, so this actually came to a head in the 1960s. I think I found this. No, that was in Open University. There was McKinsey came along to ICI, 2 enormous companies, and ICI said, "Look how efficient we are. We've got 1,500 time and motion men, 1,500." And then McKinsey said, A, it's annoying to the workforce, and B, this is a cost. Your index of efficiency is way off.
Yeah.
So in the end, they kind of tried to rationalise a lot of the time and motion men away, which the workers found absolutely hilarious, as I'm sure you can imagine.
And of course, inevitably, they were producing results that incentivised more of them being employed.
The irony of this was pointed out at the time. As I say, I found these interviews in Leicester because there was a big strike there, and they did some interviews in the 1970s. And specifically on this Beddoes system in 1932, and they said, we felt really bad for the time and motion men was trying to keep their jobs, but they were being stamped on by the management and by us because we would sing rude songs at them and things like this.
Because presumably part of what you're doing, you need to re-interrogate the data and say, actually, does it tell us what they thought it told us?
Indeed, I would need to do that. And the amount of data produced in these particular experiments, I've not done that. I've done more kind of macro studies of. People were concerned about this at the time, as we would expect if what my story is element of truth to it. They would go around. I've found 3 contemporary little bits of research that have people going around to these factories, going, you've got like 20 costing clerks just to fill in these micro forms with ones and zeros all day, every day, is it worth it? And they'd say, yes. And that it would be the manager's instinct that it was very efficient. The one thing I would say is that the costing calculations, if the system worked, so I know these sums very well now, if it worked, you'd get a 33% increase in output, 25%, not of that, but 25% of the 33% would go back to the worker in bonus pay. So when it works, all you're doing is increasing output by 8%. Relative to the cost of running it. And any amount of worker go-slows or what's it called, K-canny or strikes or anything, quickly this saving, I think, had completely evaporated to the extent it actually have cost money to run these things if they didn't work properly. And the key thing I'm pointing out here, I'm not saying the Roundtree Cocoa Works was a kind of miserable sweatshop. I'm saying it was quite nice actually compared to most factories. Some of them were really horrible.
And of course they were concentrating on one thing, which was the activities of the workers, and they might have improved productivity more by concentrating on things like operational process design if they'd understood it and just in time.
You are understanding my thesis very well. Alfred Chandler et al. Have consistently stated why the British were not doing X, Y, Z, A, B, C, vertical integration, horizontal integration, all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think to some extent only this was because the British manufacturers' attention was disproportionately attached to the workforce. Yeah. And maybe, and as I say, I don't want to bring in a kind of class analysis, but somebody who would say this was kind of, the elite were too concerned about controlling the working class.
Exactly, and rather than what they could do something about themselves without, having any.
It's also this whole thing about how ideas about what's appropriate sort of penetrate, from the top with the best intentions. And I mean, in a sense, the relevance of the voluntary sector is that somehow the idea was you have to be more businesslike, and in a sense, Roundtree and Co. are going, we have to be more businesslike, however mad it was, however, in the end, how counterproductive or how unrelated it was to what, they weren't asking workers how to increase their productivity. Because, what strikes me too is the rhythm thing, if you know anything about people working, people like in a factory, like a bit of a push. They like to, they've got to rush to finish, clear that table before 5 o'clock. But what they don't do is work at the same pace, 8 hours a day. It just doesn't take account of humans. But I mean, I guess it's just this whole thing about convincing Roundtree and all these kind of well-intentioned liberal people to take on board some really daft system and
really
run with
my point
it.
about, that despite the fact that they realised the work was boring, they did know that they were working for Roundtree in a factory that really cared about their welfare overall, and they weren't working for some other cutthroat.
Yeah.
Down the road.
It was either that or Terry's, I think, with the people to work for in York at the time, and especially if you're a teenage girl. But what was I going to say? This stuff is all relevant to Cadbury as well, but I haven't, and Unilever, but unfortunately Unilever have not given me access to the source materials I would like to look at, or they don't have them, I don't know which it is. So I innovated, and ITI is one of my main case studies, but it's fascinating, the kind of liberal scientific types. The other study I was writing about earlier today was a guy called Geoffrey Mander, who was a Liberal MP for Wolverhampton, who ran a paint factory in Wolverhampton. And they have a very full archive, and I chart how this stuff came in through there as well. And he and Roundtree and all the other. My point is, he had a science degree from Cambridge. There's this scientism is really interesting here, I think, and other people. Charles Reynolds, I look at in Manchester, was a mechanical engineer, again liberal, and so on.
Effective income tax. I know that probably the girls in mine at that time didn't pay income tax.
Okay.
They're too young and they're too lowly paid. But you did mention about the inquiries going into post-war.
Yes.
When income tax was up to, when the working class started to be taxed, as opposed to the middle class. And I wondered about the effect of income tax, because when I was doing this history work for Excel, income tax was 33%. And we used to say, done that one. The third one for the government.
Yeah.
For the
Oh
government.
yes, yeah, tax-free day and all that, yeah.
And it didn't go, it didn't like it.
I think the answer, I can answer it very quickly, I don't know. It's really interesting, I hadn't thought about it. There's a whole tranche of literature on the affluent worker in the post-war period I know about, which I know some people working on this. But I stopped in 1948, so I don't know. I look forward to finding out more about it. The answer probably is there have been enormous numbers of, costly wage negotiations between employers' federations. The trade unions was enormous by this point in the post-war period. The government, and one thing I have the instinct for this is that this stuff really came to the fore under the productivity deals introduced in the 1960s by the Ministry of Employment and Productivity. That's a story for another day. I look forward to researching that in a future project. But yeah, and that's gender does come up because one thing I have not touched upon at all is grading. Of different kinds of work and what counts as I'm sure you've all seen that film Made in Dagenham.
Yeah.
Equal pay for equal work and all that kind of thing. Well, it's not really what it was about. It was about grading and should the women machinists be on the same grade as the men machinists and all this kind of thing. There's an interesting story there. I'm not sure whether I could do it on my own. I'll try. Thanks. Yeah.
Last question, Megan.
I'm just wondering, the study generates two very different types of data. You've got the statistical data and you've got the interviews as well. So was there any problem reconciling these two?
Great, thank you for that. I've been wondering this myself. There was these codification of, and anyone who's interested in history of emotions, there was, as part of the other report, which I've got in here, and which Roundtree actually wrote the introduction to, as you can see, Incentives and Contentment. He and others are trying to categorize emotions and how they link into all these different factors. They're not very good studies, but they're trying anyway. This is 1930 something. And how to gel together the qualitative and the quantitative research. I think just collect it all together and see what comes out that's useful, I think, and what's workable. There could be, I could write a study, I suppose, of kind of the R&D dynamics implementation of this factory. And I hope one of the things I'm trying to get across here is this is like university level research at the time being conducted somewhere that isn't a university. And this again is something that often people have complained about, is Britain didn't do business schools enough. And several of the companies I look at had the activity level of a business school, even if they weren't producing MBAs. But to answer your question is, they thought about it really hard. Give me some inspiration. What kind of ways would you do this?
I don't know, how do you measure something like boredom? Were they counting how many times they yawned, or?
Yes. That kind of not quite tabulating it to that level of specificity, but pretty much yes. One of the things to point out is all of this is high output is taken to be workers are doing well, and low output is workers are doing badly, which is an interesting index of success because it doesn't have to be an index of success. They could look at the length of their lives or something if they wanted to. But, interesting.
Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Actually stimulating, and we can, we've got some stuff to drink. So if you'd like to stick around, there won't be any kind of time and motion study on how fast you make it. Thank you. Thank you very much.